Sorry about that. Is that okay? All right? Sounds okay? Okay. I keep saying I'm going to be finishing up these series of talks, investigations on nature and cultivation, but they seem to be going on. So tonight I'll try to do the last one again. But there also seems to be interest in this topic as well. So we started with this idea of getting lost in the water, getting lost in the way. It was a passage from the Zhuangzi, and where Zhuangzi described how fish prosper and thrive when they're immersed in the water and deeply in the water. And then by comparison, he said people prosper and thrive if they can immerse themselves and get lost in the way. Fish survive by getting lost in the water, people by getting lost in the way. This idea of getting lost is really a paradox expression in this tradition. And the reason it's that way is we are lost already. From the sage's point of view, from a Buddha's point of view or Bodhisattva's point of view, we as living beings are lost, confused. And so getting lost in the way is actually getting found. And finding ourselves in the world is getting lost to the way. And so often this language is used, getting lost in the mountains, getting lost in the forest, getting lost in nature, as actually a kind of almost poetic but psychological way of saying returning to our true selves, returning to our true home. So this really ties into a series of things I wanted to share tonight. In most of the sutra text and all of the attributions to the Buddha, you constantly see this expression that we're asleep, we're as if drunk and dreaming. The chant says, born drunk and dying in a dream. We had this sort of benighted, half awake, half asleep, mostly asleep, wandering through what they call the long night of samsara. And so actually what we call Buddhism or Buddha Dharma is really just a name for the teachings and exercises of waking up. Buddha just means originally awake and aware. It's not actually an individual, it's not a person, it's more a state of mind, a liberated state of being, one who becomes aware and awake to things as they really are and lives accordingly. In the small b is Buddha, aware and awake. So it's really interesting that this teaching itself is the teaching of awakening or being aware, which is the opposite of drunken dreaming. This becomes really important for understanding what we're doing when we say we're doing self-cultivation. And this is why you find sometimes these seemingly contrary or nonsensical to some people teachings. For example, in the Platform Sutra, you'll see basically there's not one thing, work and dust alike. I have no dharma to give you. There is no teaching to give you. I simply use expedients to untie knots and call it a teaching. You find this throughout. And you not only find it in the what some people call the Mahayana sutras, you also find it also in the Theravada teachings, as the use of the raft, for example. My teaching is like a raft. It's simply expediently used to get to the other shore. Once on the other shore, the raft has served its purpose and there's no need to cling to it. In other words, there is nothing really there. The Avatamsaka sometimes goes so far, it actually says, like all Buddhas, anyone who becomes awake or aware awakens to the truth of not self. And just like all Buddhas are not. That's actually what the Avatamsaka says. And what it's saying there is basically even the word Buddha is almost like a conventional expression that we use to describe arriving at this original state of mind. And when I say arriving, it's like it's a returning to this original state of mind. So in the Heart Sutra tradition, there's a wonderful line it says, why is there great wisdom? Why do we seem to have great wisdom? And the answer is because the stupid or ignorance makes its mark. And so this contrast is presented is the Dharma, the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, are expedient language we use or we borrow to cause us to turn away from this confusion or this dreamy state, and then return to the original ground, what's called our true nature, which doesn't have any of these markings, doesn't have these demarcations. Without being lost and without being asleep, there actually is not only no need for Dharma, there is no Dharma. Dharma ceases when awakening reestablishes itself. And so, just so you see, I'm not kind of making something up here. In the Platform Sutra, for example, you'll see this expression, all Buddhas of the past, present, and future. So this is including a vision of awakening available to all living beings. Otherwise, you wouldn't say past, present, and future. It's referring to the potential of living beings that ever were, that are, or will be, have, and then the text goes on, as well as the 12 divisions of the sutra. So all of the teachings, as well as all Buddhas, are originally inherent, whole, and complete within human nature. And it's really a powerful statement. If they're originally whole and complete within human nature, then there's nothing, quote, to be done except to be undone. There's nothing to kind of be found so much as to lose what's in the way. So getting lost in the way is actually this refinding. But the text is very clear. Huineng goes on to say, but if you can't understand on your own, if you can't see this on your own, you must seek out a wise and good advisor who can lead you to see this. So this is where I think, going to the earlier section when I quoted the Earth Store Sutra, where it says the Bodhisattva finds intractable, difficult people to teach and transform and manifest in all kinds of expedient ways to cause people to get lost or return, being in the language. And you see this also in the Avatamsaka, especially in the chapter 39 with Sudana's journey. He goes to 52, 53 teachers. They're all very, very different. But they all have the same impetus. They all have the same message, even though they manifest differently. They're just helping him get lost. In other words, helping him find himself again, to twist the language a little bit that way. And so the same thing happens with these teachings. Then the Huineng, the patriarch, answers, if there, and this is from the text, if there were no people in the world, all the myriad Dharma teachings would not exist by themselves. They're really important line because it's going to basically affirming the heart of this teaching is all beings have this nature, this enlightened, awakened, pure nature. All can realize it. It's only because of grasping and attaching, or trying to grasp and attach and covering it over, or deluded thinking that they do not manifestly realize it in the here and now. That's at the heart of it. So then, if you think about it that way and understand without confusion or the state of confused living beings, there is no need and there is no dharma. Dharma arises completely in response to that stimulus. And that stimulus seemingly is a kind of dual dimension of compassion and wisdom that is at play here. Go to the Lotus Sutra. This is another one. And basically, in the Lotus Sutra, what the Buddha is saying to Shariputra, and this is the line, he says, "O Shariputra, the Buddhas," and this would mean of the past, current, or future, "come into or manifest, appear to us in the world." It doesn't mean necessarily like they are coming from outer space and born into it. They appear and manifest in our world only for this one great matter. And this one great matter of purpose is, to quote the text, to cause living beings to aspire to purity and the wisdom and the insight of a Buddha. So again, this presupposes that this potential is whole and complete in any living being, and all a Buddha is doing with the teachings, we call the Dharma, is acting as a catalyst to cause the opening and the understanding of this insight, which is inherent. So why I'm stressing this so much is I feel as if, again, I said this last week, and building on the Earth Store's theme of a bodhisattva manifesting as parks and meadows and streams and rivers and forests and mountains to cause living beings to return to purity and have that wisdom and insight, they actually manifest as powerful elements of nature. And so then you can see that all these texts that talk about this tendency of people to get lost, and then the corresponding therapeutic, compassionate response to reorient, to bring them back from the lost condition, is at the heart not only of the Buddhist tradition, but I would say many of the East and South Asian traditions themselves. I mentioned this before, Mencius has the famous passage where he says a farmer loses his pig or his sheep and he goes out all night looking for that one sheep or pig that he's lost, yet we lose this, our essential nature, and don't know to go look for it. And so it's kind of a scolding, but it's pointing to the fact we are lost and we forget, we're lost to the fact that we're lost. So it's compounded. Chan has the expression, we turn our backs on enlightenment and unite with the dust. And so the whole purpose of the teacher and the teachings is to turn our backs on the dust and reconnect with enlightenment. But they describe it like this. They don't describe it like that. And sometimes this is used. How quick was that, they say. The teacher says, how quick was that? Dust, enlightenment, enlightenment, dust. Just that quick. So it's not something you go out and get, but it's something you see. Cow Mountain, one of my favorites, this is also from the Confucian tradition, talks about the original pure state of the mountain that gets eroded and corrupted and polluted over time, but with nature being left to do its own work, it comes back again. It starts to flourish again, but then we come again, chop it down, strip mine, whatever you call it, and then graze until it's bare, and then we think, when we see the mountain in this state, it was always like this. It was just a wasteland. And Mencius says, no, just as this mountain was once a beautiful, pristine wilderness, so too in the person, and he used the metaphor in every one of us, there is this original, pure, wilderness-like mountain state. and only because we neglect it and basically, from his point of view, associate with bad friends outside and uncontrolled or unmanaged inner afflictions, klesha, passions, and desires, do we get lost. But he said that can't be returned to simply the way the mountain is returned to by coming back to one's nature. Mencius's mother was the same thing. When he was growing up, she noticed that he was a reflection of his environment. So when he was put next to the crematory and the funerary thing, he started to get morbid and started to make little images and whatnot of dead people and burying them in the ground and got in this very yin state. Next to the butcher shop, he started to lose his sensibility and compassion and became coarse. So then she moved him apparently next to a good school, which I imagine then as now is hard to find because good schools are not necessarily what we think they are, but it was a good school in that it taught virtue and character as well as learning. And then he started to come into his center, started to become a whole and complete person with what was, from her point of view as a mother, what was proper to being a human being. And so you see this, and then the expression from that is, from this passage, if you draw near the rouge, like lipstick, hang around that, you'll turn red. If you draw near coal, you'll turn black. And so the idea was that one immerses and loses oneself in the way, in the mountains, in the forest, as part of the recovery of that nature. So instead of drawing near the rouge or the black, you're drawing near to the green and the clear, to extend that metaphor. And so the thing is here, part of the gift of the human, and this is from the text, and also part of the, if you want to use the curse or the impediment, is our immense adaptability. We can, in fact, adapt and assimilate to all kinds of environments, for better or for worse. In environments of war and aggression and hatred, people quickly assimilate into that mode and lose their humanity, not knowing how it even happens. We are so culturally attuned, socially attuned, so able to be conditioned that that's what happened. Converse is you draw near to good people, you draw near to cultivators of the way, you're surrounded by that, and that puts out a vibe and an atmosphere, so to speak, that transforms you even when you're not consciously doing that. So the thing is, these texts are all, when Huineng says, if you can't do this on your own, if you're morally dissolute and you're lost, you need to find a good advisor. I would say in the parallels I'm doing tonight, you need to find that natural environment to support that. Now, at the very least, on the inside, you could say it's precepts and some environment that allows you to focus and concentrate your mind and gain some equanimity that would then return the insight. A monastery is basically an architectural manifestation of Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna, the three non-outflow studies. A monastery in the woods doubles that because the woods themselves encourage Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. So you have a monastery within a monastery when you have a temple, a way place, a hermitage, a vihara, if you want to use that language, in the woods. So you double the power of the influence of the environment plus the influence of the three non-outflow study practice model. This has always been super attractive to cultivators of the way across traditions, and I want to share some of that tonight. But this idea of being lost and drunk and dreaming, I say it, this is how the Chan expression talks about it. And if you look at it, the very language of Buddha or Buddhism meaning awakening is built on the opposite of asleep, dreaming. I mean, psychologically, you got to see this is a teaching of awakening. It's not a religion per se, but a teaching of awakening from this inverted state. In modern psychology, I just want to share what I think are three ideas that sort of hit at this, but from modern psychological language. One is the term hedonic adaptation. Hedonic adaptation. This describes how human beings become insensitive to new stimuli and quickly readjust to some emotional baseline. Therefore, in order to feel a rush of some change, they have to create another emotion like happiness or excitement to sort of raise the ante. It needs to be more intense than the last stimulus because the stimulus goes down to hedonic adaptation. And so you start to climb on this, upping the ante, upping the ante, and yet no matter how much you add, you always reach this plateau of blah, you know. And that's why it's sometimes called the hedonic treadmill. If you know what a treadmill is, like you see, what do they think? Hamsters in the cage, right? They just keep going around. They're on a treadmill that you're on, but you're not really going anyplace. Because we always end up where we started, back to this plateau. So that's one idea that you can use from modern psychology to describe sort of this tendency in humans of the drunken dreaming, hedonic adaptation. The whole economy is built on that. The constant wanting bigger, better, more, newer versions is based on the fact that as soon as we get one version, within an X amount of short period of time, we hedonically, hedonistically adapt and reach that flat plateau again, and then the next one comes out and we want and need that. And the rest of that goes in landfill, which in a sense destroys the very natural world we need to recover from. So, I mean, the cycles of this is really crazy. The other idea is also from modern psychology, and this is called desensitization. And that means there's a diminished emotional responsiveness to a negative or aversive stimulus. So what that means is that we tune out, we desensitize, and the more sometimes powerful it is, the more we mute our response, and we become as if numb. They noticed this, for example, with figures from war or during COVID. As the numbers went up, people just started to not note how many millions of people were suffering and dying each day. You can see the news from Ukraine. Already, you're desensitizing and saying, oh, 100 missiles went in today, and you just go to the next page because you are getting, and understandably you might want to do this as self-protection, but the danger of this is it also self-insulates and keeps you away from reality. And this can happen not only with negative, but with positive stimulus. After repeated exposure, we desensitize. So what I'm trying to describe is using modern psychology of the hedonic adaptation, the desensitization tendency, and then finally this one called habituation. And that's a decrease in response to a stimulus that's repeated. The psychologists describe this way: growing accustomed to a situation or a stimulus, thereby diminishing its effectiveness. And I remember there's a famous Chan expression for this habituation. It says, in the flower shop, you no longer smell the flowers. In the fish market, you no longer smell the fish. Eating meat, you no longer hear the cries of the slaughterhouse at midnight. Things like this, basically taking hedonic adaptation, desensitization, and this habituation where we no longer are alert and sensitive to the very factors that control and determine our lives and existence. So this is a modern way sort of looking at this drunken dreaming thing, that it's not just a sort of spiritually talking about something in these texts, but it's actually talking about a human condition we can observe firsthand right now going on in ourselves, in the country, in the world. It's really remarkable. And yet, on top of this, we still have this ability to turn this around. But, and this is where I think Buddhas, bodhisattvas, they say, come into the world appear. They come in as sobering influences, as splashes of cold water, of breaking into or interrupting the habituation, the desensitization, the hedonic adaptation. When you say afflictions are endless, I vow to cut them all off, the Chinese character actually is duan, which does mean to cut off, but it more originally meant to interfere with or to interrupt the flow of, like as with stream. So if you see the duan as you're cold water splashing on it, changing it dramatically as to interrupt that habituation. Then you see with you're working with afflictions is you're not smashing them or cutting them off. You're merely resensitizing yourself to their effect and their impact. So where I was going with this is sort of then what I see the potential, or what I feel myself, the potential of nature along these lines to be that influence. I quoted to Thoreau last time, but I wanted to finish up on a quote. After he goes off on his journey to Walden Pond, he leaves the family position, the family job. He doesn't push his education to some level of getting a job and so forth. He goes there to really confront. He goes there in a sense to wake up. I read you that passage of his where he says, I went to confront life, to drive it into the corner and really understand it for what it was. If we're born only to die, what do I make of that interval in between? While he's there, he writes this. And because he's criticized for being impractical, people come by and say, you're young, you're educated, and so forth. You're being very impractical living in this little cabin by the pond here. Get with it. And his response was, and this is from his journal, he says, what after all does the practicalness of life amount to? The things immediate to be done are very trivial. I could postpone them all just to hear a locust sing. The most glorious fact in my experience is not anything that I have done or may hope to do, but a transient thought or vision or dream which I have had. I would give all the wealth of the world and all the deeds of all the heroes for one true vision. This vision, this scene, is basically what the Platform Sutra says, Jien, to see things as they really are, to see and behold one's nature. This is the vision. He's not talking about an altered hallucination state of consciousness. He's saying the vision of penetrating through the veil and seeing things as they really are. I would give anything to really break out of the drunken, dreamy state. And then he says, rhetorically, why should we be in such a desperate haste to succeed and in such desperate enterprises, constantly going from job to job, working 9, 10, 12, 14 hours a day, accumulating money that we barely have time to spend, and when we spend it, we buy things that we really don't need, think we want, but as soon as we get them, they turn out to be flat as everything else, and then we're back on the treadmill again and again, hedonic adaptation. He says, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, everybody who's busy and running around, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Someone who's brought forth the Bodhi resolve is hearing a different drummer. They're responding to a different sound. They're following a different North Star. It's actually different, at 180 degrees different than. And he says, this person, let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. So this is a wonderful expression, basically, of this idea of turning and reconnecting and waking up. And when you do that, I would say that sound of that different drummer, for me at least in my growing up, turned out originally to be the wilderness, the woods, the forests, the mountains, the streams in where I grew up in Wisconsin, then later wherever I went. When I wanted to get in touch with that sound and that music of my soul or my heart again, I would go into the natural world because it came so clear, so pure, without me even asking or seeking for it, and often in its own rhythms and ways that just would catch me off guard. And it's in that off-guardedness that I rediscovered something of who I am. So I'm saying that I think nature is a major medicine for sobering up. And it's waking up is the mountains and forest. It's an antidote. So Thoreau's idea, when he says, in wildness lies the preservation of the world, I would say in the woods and mountains lies the sanity and salvation of people. And now let me quote. This is a line actually from the Avatamsaka Sutra. Sitting quietly in the mountains and forest, cultivate yourself in all aspects, and you can see the flowing of illusory thoughts in your own mind. The flowing of illusory thoughts in your own mind is the drunken, dreamy state that's talked about. And in the Avatamsaka Sutra, it's saying, sitting quietly, I'm quoting directly, quietly in the mountains and forest, you cultivate yourself in all respects, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and you then see your mind and you see the illusory thoughts. When you see the illusory flow, that very scene then breaks it up and you return. So I think that all of this, the forest, the mountains, the rivers, even the sea and the ocean, all are medicine. They're dharma medicine, they're prescriptions. It actually is a dharma door, Vaman. Correspondingly, as with most dharma doors and with most good medicine, it is often bitter to the taste. In other words, when we get sick and dreamy and drunk, the antidote at first hits us uncomfortably. It at first hits us as almost anachronistically, as anathema, as I don't want this. And so often the first experience of the mountains and the forests and wilderness is this kind of anxiety and nervousness. It's too quiet, it's too still. Nothing's going on. That's the first response of hedonic adaptation overstimulation. It's not really that it's boring. It's that we're way over the top in the addiction to stimulation. Once you get past that, the calm and the peace and the insight that can come after that medicine starts to take hold is very remarkable. But at first, you kind of have to break out of that. So some of the first signs of waking up from the drunken dreaming, just starting to wake up a little bit, is not fitting in. When you start to feel, I don't fit in with everybody. Like Thoreau says, what is the practicalness, what does that all amount to? Why does everybody trying to succeed? And you can't quite figure that out. As a poet said, I'm a stranger and afraid in a world I never made. That feeling of not fitting in is actually the first signs or symptoms of the return. Also, feeling trapped and weighted down, weary, is also one of the signs of the beginning of the stirring towards the return. But at first, it's not necessarily just positive. It's not necessarily just an aspiration. Often, it's a discontent, almost a displacement or an alienation. The other thing that's associated, I would associate it with it, is a kind of hunger. And I mean, not just food and clothes and sleep and the material things. There's a hunger for those, but this is a hunger that comes because those don't satisfy. There's a deeper hunger of the soul or the spirit that is not easily satisfied or made content. That hunger is actually, and you see this in the life of the Buddha, he could not be satisfied by all the things that were given to him to be satisfied. There was a hunger, if you will, and that hunger was for the way, for something deep and truthful. So to recognize these symptoms in ourselves, not fitting in, the weighted heaviness, the weariness, and a kind of itch or hunger can be negative. It can be that you're not well. But in this particular instance, what's associated with these corresponding insights and movings in your heart and mind, usually they're the beginnings of the way. I want to just maybe, there's so much more I could go into, but two more things. I want to share a section, because I left out the ocean and the sea, the mountains, the forests, the streams, the rivers. But again, for many people, especially for us on the West Coast, or people on the East Coast, or on any coast, or are drawn to the coast, the ocean and the sea itself become a powerful ground of nature for this medicinal corrective. This one I want to share because it comes from chapter 39 of the Avatamsaka Sutra. And in this case, the pure youth Sudna, on his epic journey for awakening and basically coming out of the dream state, says, I can't do it on my own. I've done a lot on my own. I brought forth the resolve. I'm really purely holding the precepts. I'm very sincere, but the accumulated muddleness and confusion that I have generated still lingers, and I need to find good teachers to help me see my way. So he goes progressively from one teacher to the next teacher. And this one, and the sutra says this is a refrain. And so he finishes with his last teacher, and his last teacher says, I've taught you everything I can. It's up to you, embody it now. I can't teach you anymore. And he gets really sad, and he says to the guy, don't worry, there's another teacher to the south, so you can go to him. And so he bows and he reluctantly leaves, and then as he's leaving, as he's on his way, he says, well, maybe there's a really good teacher. So here it begins, it says, he gradually went south until he arrived at the kingdom gate of the sea. This is his next teacher. At that place, the bhikshu, Sea Cloud, and he bowed at Sea Cloud's feet. And after circumambulating him to the right, he put his palms together before him and he said, Sagely one, I've already brought forth the resolve for Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. I wish to enter all of the seas of unsurpassed wisdom. You could substitute all of the mountains, all of the forest of unsurpassed wisdom. These are metaphors. So basically saying, I don't yet know how I can finally fully wake up. Please help me. And Bhikshu Sea Cloud's answer basically here is let the sea expand your mind. Let the sea break you out of your silo of self. And he says to the big, I gave a paraphrase, I don't know how to fully wake up. What he actually says, I do not know how a bodhisattva can renounce the mundane home of the world and be born in the thus come one's household, or how he can cross over the sea of birth and death and enter a Buddha's wisdom sea, or how one can leave the ground of an ordinary person and enter the ground of the thus come one, or how one can sever the flow of birth and death and enter in the bodhisattva's conduct. He goes on, he's saying, this is what I see, but I don't know quite how to do it. How can I dry up the sea, he's using sea again, of love and desire and increase the sea of great compassion? What a contrast. Dry up the sea of love and desire and increase, and therefore naturally increases the sea of compassion. That formula right there is really important. It's not that you have to generate compassion. That sea fills up by itself when the sea of love and desire is reduced. How can one close all the doors of difficulties, of the evil destinies, and open the doors of great nirvana? He goes on, this is just beautifully poetic. The response that comes is really wonderful here. Good man, this is Sea Cloud, I have lived in this country, gate of the sea, for 12 years. Last time we said they were 3 to 5 years in the mountains. Remember the hermits? He's 12 years at the sea, so you can extend your stay. When you find a place that's conducive to the way, don't be in a hurry to leave. In contrast, when you find that one is, get out of it like it's a burning house, my humble advice. Then he says, I've been here 12 years, and I quote now, I've always regarded the sea as my state. Specifically, I've pondered how the great sea is vast and extensive without measure. I pondered how the great sea is profoundly deep and hard to fathom. I pondered the gradual deepening and widening of the great sea. I pondered the limitless, rare, and wonderful adorned jewels within the great sea. I pondered the immeasurable amount of water that is gathered by the great sea. I pondered the inconceivability of the different colors, the hues of the water in the great sea. And he goes on, I pondered the great sea as a dwelling place for limitless creatures. I pondered how the great sea encompasses all the beings, small and large bodies. I pondered how the great sea receives the rain of the large clouds when it pours down and yet never fills or overflows. I pondered how the great sea was without increase or decrease. Obviously, this is a metaphor for the nature and for the awakened state and for the Dharma realm, but he's using the sea as a mirror to do this. And he says, good man, when I was contemplating, I also had this thought. Within this world, is there anything more broad and extensive than this sea? Is there anything more immeasurable than the sea? Is there anything deeper than the sea? Is there anything more rare and special than the sea? And so he's using it to contemplate his potential nature. But you see what he's doing to Sudana, he's saying, let your mind expand and open to this great wisdom capacity that is metaphorically symbolized by the sea. So, I just wanted to share that because I left the sea out, and yet I quoted you that poem by Robert Frost last time where he says everybody, even if they're not cultivators, goes to the shore, goes to the sea, and they turn their back on the land and they look out at the sea in a kind of almost involuntary, instinctual, contemplative mode. And maybe they see some of this. Maybe they feel, wow, that's so vast and it's overwhelming. You can go into this quite a bit. You can view one of the contemplations, each wave is a thought. And so you watch the various waves, thought after thought come, and you use it as a meditation topic. This thought comes, rises, and gone. A next one right behind it. So the conditioned mind, thought after thought. You can use it as life after life. You can use it as country after country, relationship after relationship, body after body, contemplating impermanence, impersonality, and so forth. So there's so much you can do. All right, I wanted to finish with some poetry because there's some people who are listening that really like poetry, and I do too. There is something called wilderness poetry. Wilderness poetry. And in ancient times, it was part of a profound new engagement with wilderness that arose among, and I'm using Chinese now, Chinese artists and intellectuals, cultivators. So it was a profound new engagement with wilderness. The serene mountains, for them, contrasted with corrupt political culture, social culture, media culture, and also with a superficial life of career and suffocating social life. Now, for them, careers were different than now, but careers are careers. Careers are very seldom what you love. Again, Robert Frost says, to make what you love and what you have to do one, that's good. Your avocation, your vocation, to make them one. This is very difficult, but if you can do that, good for you. When we talk about right livelihood in Buddhahood, in Buddhist teachings, it has to do something with this not harmful, but an underlying thing that is also fulfilling. It is right in the sense that it centers and fulfills you and also can maybe benefit the world. So I don't think the underlying impulse for this wilderness poetry has changed much. The suffocating social career type entanglements and involvements and the corrupt culture that they withdrew from. Now, there's two, if you give me some grace here tonight, there's largely two strands of this. One is called the Fields and Gardens wilderness poetry. Fields and Gardens wilderness poetry. The other one's called Rivers and Mountains wilderness poetry. So the rivers and mountains are the vast, deep, remote, far away, the Rocky Mountains, the Sierras, up around 10,000 feet. That's the rivers and mountains. The fields and gardens are actually more rural, more agricultural. Could even be a garden in your backyard. But it's, even though they seem to be different, there's no fundamental distinction between them. These are poets or intellectuals writing about just different dimensions or scales of nature. And this is what Thoreau did. Thoreau was Walden Pond wasn't where John Muir lived in the high mountains. John Muir went to the high mountains very remote, so he would be a mountain or rivers poet. Thoreau was more what we call a field and gardens poet. But he found wildness in even those things that you can find in your backyard or in a park or a walk by the sea. They have the same sensibilities, just on a different scale. And they're kind of enfolding. One contains the other, and one leads to the other. And you can find the mountains and the rivers in the smaller spaces, and in the smaller places, you can find the great. To see the universe, in the palm of your hand, the grain in a grain of sand, this quote by, what's his name? Blake. Thank you, William Blake. I just heard a voice. Anyhow, so I wanted to share just two poems with you tonight. I've been sharing with you some of Cold Mountain, Hanshan's poems. That's, well, who's he? Which one? Huh? Which of the two varieties? Oh, he's definitely mountains and rivers. Rivers and mountains, right. So he's a rivers and mountain poet. So I share with him. So I'm going to share tonight with you two different ones. This one is coming from someone called Tao Qian. And Tao Qian was one of the earliest ones. So he's around 300 to 400 Common Era. And he is what's considered an example or an exemplar of the Fields and Gardens one. But listen to the theme of this in his poem. Nothing like all the others, even as a child, rooted in such love for the hills and mountains. That's how he opens. He says, I wasn't like all the other children. Even as a child, I was rooted in the love of the hills and the mountains. I stumbled into their net of dust, that one departure, a blunder lasting 13 years. But a tethered bird longs for its old forest, and a pond fish longs for its deep waters. And so now, my southern outlands cleared, I nurture simplicity among these fields and gardens, home again. This theme of home again, you see it in Tao Yan Ming, I'm going home again. This is not just talking about birthplace, it's talking about nature, self-nature place. Home again. I've got nearly 2 acres here and 4 or 5 rooms in this thatch hut. Elms and willows shading the eaves in the black, and in the front, peach and plum spread wide. Villages lost across mist and haze distances, kitchen smoke drifting in wide open country. Dogs bark deep among back roads out here, and roosters crow from the mulberry treetops. No confusion within these gates, no dust. My empty home harbors idleness to spare. Back again after so long caged in that trap, I return to things coming into themselves. This is a wonderful poem. But he's talking about the feeling of trapped, I mentioned before, coming back to simplicity, to a life that isn't in the deep mountains or forests, but a remove from just the civilized world. And his livelihood is close to nature. It's simple. So I will, there's so much I could, let me finish this last one, and that'll be it for tonight. And maybe this will be it on the Mountain ME lectures. We'll see. And of course, and I read something or I go for a walk and I get inspired again. And anyhow, but I really do think this is all part of the Avatamsaka from my point of view. Anyhow, so this is a much later poet. This is around, 1000 Common Era. And this is someone called Monk Heng Sure. What's interesting about Monk Heng Sure is he spent his later years, now his first part of his life was he graduated Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, and then went on to a job at the firm, Google, Amazon, or the law firm, and then pretty much figured out this sucks, this is a dead end, I'm not going to continue to do this. Then he said has spent his later years practicing Chan with really deep devotion, wandering the mountains around his home, a passion that was an extension of his Chan cultivation of Wuxian, no mind, Wuxiang, Wuxian, and writing poems that reflected his Taoist Chan cultivation of the rivers and the mountain realm. So this is what he's doing. And so when he goes in and he leaves all this behind, something awakens in him that was dormant. He's no longer trapped. And as he deepens his meditation practice in this space, he starts to create a poetry or an expression that he wants to share that comes close to almost the voicings that he is picking up between his conversation with his own heart and the natural world. And this is a very short poem. It's basically just 4 lines. Going all day into the mountains, I can't get enough of the mountains. Retire into the mountains. Retire into the mountains, and the mountains become your old masters. This is really wonderful. Retire into the mountains, and the mountains become your old masters. Next 2 lines and the last. When mountain blossoms scatter away, mountains always remain. And in empty mountain stream water, mountain deepens idleness. So this Remember, we started this, the clouds have vanished into the sky, the birds have vanished into the sky, and now the last cloud fades away. I sit together the mountain and me until only the mountain remains. That's Li Po. And you have a similar expression here by him, who's saying, when the mountain blossoms scatter, mountain always remain, and in empty mountain stream water, I deepen in my idleness. He's losing himself in this. But the passage I really love here that really makes sense to me, the mountains become your masters, the mountains become your teachers. This has been my experience. So share with you tonight. We will end there and back to the Avatamsaka proper, perhaps, next Friday, or back into the mountains, which is the same.
So, Marty, you mentioned that many people love poems, and can you hear me? Okay. And I bring one poem with myself, one of my favorite ones, with a favorite poet who came from the same country what I'm raised, Poland, but somehow is local here. He was local here, and he was a professor in Department of Slavic Languages and Literature.
What's his name?
Czesław Miłosz.
Oh, yeah, of course.
More well known after he win or laureate of Nobel Prize in 1980. And in his poems, actually, a lot of he refers to nature, spirituality, and how the people can find the humanity through the nature. So the title is This Only. A valley, and above it forest in autumn colors. A voyager arrives, a map leads him there, or perhaps memory. Once long ago in the sun, when snow first fell, riding this way he felt joy, strong, without reason. Joy of the eyes. Everything was the rhythm of shifting trees, of a bird in flight, of a train on the viaduct, a feast in motion. He returns years later, has no demands. He wants only one most precious thing, to see, purely and simply, without name, without expectations, fears or hopes, at the edge where there is no I or not I. And anytime I'm reading this, it's like, oh, he was a Buddhist, or definitely he was a contemplator in many ways. And I very love how he even struck this poem, kind of the pain of the experience of this voyager, his deep transformation, using the nature when he, entered the valley and the forest and the colors, autumn. And we don't experience, I think, here in California, this transition of the seasons. What I think, Marty, definitely you can see in Maine or East Coast or in Europe, that, like he says, when this transition, when the first snow fall and in the sun, and he says, you can experience the amazing brightness, like everything is covered by this vast up to the horizon, clear snow. What is, you cannot even look at. You have to put sunglasses with so pure light. It's very transformative, inspiring. And it's, of course, question is how much the nature catalyzed this voyager experience and how some shifts in him allows him to see this with new eyes, with joyful eyes, that everything was in the fast, in rhythm, in the dance to some extent. And I really love it. He says he returned years later and has no demands. I really love this, no demands. As Marty talked about these hedonic adaptations, how much we need to feel satisfied, to feel content. How much we need to earn, how much to have to TVs, cars, or phones, or apps. He has no demands. He has only one thing, and the title is This Only. There's only one thing, to see purely, simply, without name. Talking about seeing, and like he says about Thoreau, to came to the wilderness to find this vision, to seeing something with this pure and simple way. Kind of, it will remind me one of the retreats when I was years ago in Poland, by the way, like maybe 40 kilometers from the capital, Warsaw, in the kind of countryside, very gentle nature. It was the Chan retreat in the one of the last days. We have a kind of exercise to sit outside and listen. Listen the sounds, just the sound, without trying to identify what we hear, what this from kind of object came from the sound. Just hear the sound. And I remember one of my friends, his name is Mikołaj, who is what is the man who is studying the birds? Ornithologist. He's ornithologist, a graduate in Israel, who loves nature, loves the birds, and he says, when I listening these birds, first time, I don't try to name them, don't try to put in some category. Usually I put even the Latin name, like a good scientist, right? First time I can remind me this experience, he hears something purely and simply, just connect deeply with the nature, with the sound. And it was, wow, this is quite something. And of course the last line is at the edge, where we can see something purely and simply without expectations, fears and hopes, on the edge where there is no I or not I. I can maybe leave ourselves with open question. What do we need to do to see in this way? Purely and simply, beyond I.
Wow. Can you recite it in Polish?
Yeah, in Polish it's been more beautiful than in English.
It is. Next week, recite it in Polish, because I really like to hear poetry. Hearing poetry in its original language it's another poem almost.
Oh, it's true. Okay.
Anyhow,
Okay.
not that I'd understand it in Polish, but I get the bird sound of it.
The
so to
bird
speak.
sound, yeah. Yeah.
Any announcements you need to make? Or?
Yes. So tomorrow we have whole day of practices, like every day. In the morning ceremony. We have meditation at 6:15 a.m. But it's not open for everyone, right? The meditation is only open on Thursdays and Fridays, for now, publicly. But we have a 7:30 p.m. lecture by Monk Heng Sure, who returned from Queensland, and he's lecturing here in Berkeley. And people can come in person, but it has to be masked and distance and so forth. But it's opportunity to hear alive the lecture. Otherwise, Chuan, should we have anything else in? Marty, we have some important day today. And maybe we can invite everyone here to join me and celebrate some important, you're talking about the home when you was born some years ago. Can remind this moment, this very moment, in December 2nd.
It's not just years ago, it's decades.
Jishwasher, you want to join me? And of course, anyone here, and we can invite also among ourselves people online in the heart and wish all the best to our dear Marty to inspire us, like the teaching, point to the teaching, put it in nature, and inspire us as you do to be better people, better humans, and don't forget who we truly are, what is our potential. So, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to Marty. Happy birthday to you. Amitofo.
Amitofo.
Now we do the real song, the transference.
May every living beings, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace, with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all sorrow leave their grief and pain.
May this
Boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of painters into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bowing respect to the triple jewels.